Ребятки, всем привет на нашем канале YouTube. Элизабет Орловский. Сейчас я сделаю такое немножко вступление насчет того, что веселье начинается с Атлантического океана, конечно. И что происходит? Идет очень тяжелый ураган Ирма, вот его показывают. Он сейчас подходит к Сан-Джуану. К Сан-Джуану — это острова, районы Кубы. Вот. Сейчас посмотрим, что передают. Значит, ситуация очень тяжелая. Ураган 5-й категории. Это очень серьезная штука. Вот показывают сейчас острова Пуэрто-Рико. Сейчас, одну секунду. Люди вот пытаются закрыть все окна, потому что очень огромная скорость этого урагана. Вот Трамп выступает, собирает в Белом доме срочные сборы всех. Почему? Потому что, вот показывают, потому что ураган очень серьезный, действительно. О, это уже серьезно. И ураган движется в сторону Флорида, Майами. Очень тяжелая ситуация будет, потому что ветер такой сильный ветер. Сейчас, одну секунду, ребята. Все люди запасаются всем, чем есть. Все власти выступают сейчас с обращением к народу, потому что действительно ситуация тяжелая. Людям надо набрать всем, чем можно, водой. Вода, это значит аккумуляторные батареи, потому что, конечно, электричество гавкнет, то есть упадет все. Вот она рассказывает, сейчас Пуэрто-Рико, потом Гаити, Доминиканская республика, потом Багамы и Флорида, это где-то ближе суббота-воскресенье. Он туда дойдет. On exactly what type of impacts we have for the U.S. Most of the models are very consistent in that short term, right up until that right-hand turn. But then you'll notice we start to see some of that change. Some of the models make that right-hand turn over the Bahamas, meaning that it could end up being a landfall, say, anywhere from Georgia up to, say, around Wilmington, North Carolina. Она рассказывает, да. Ребята, каждый может сейчас включить у себя трансляцию, прямой эфир и посмотреть действительно, что передают. Действительно, очень серьезное положение. Ураган сейчас заходит, это Сан-Джуан, это Пуэрто-Рико. Люди эвакуируются, потому что portions of Dominican Republic, as well as the Turks and Caicos, and then other areas looking at tropical storm warnings or hurricane watches, hoping to give people enough of a heads up
Да,
so
тяжелая
they can get their
ситуация.
preparations underway. We've talked about strong winds being a huge concern with this storm, but storm surge is also going to be a big factor. Where the storm is located right now, we've been looking at storm surge around 7 to 11 feet. Over the northern portion of Puerto Rico, we're talking 4 to 6 feet. But notice how much it jumps.
Ну, это то, что рассказывают сейчас.
That has to do with their location in relative terms to the storm. For example, the storm is expected to cut in between, making the Turks and Caicos and the Bahamas in what we call the north right quadrant, which can most often
Да, мы будем переживать за тех, кто живет вот, ну вот именно эта часть, где вот видите, она показывает сегодня это будет Пуэрто-Рико, четверг это будет уже Доминиканская республика, потом пятница это будет Багамы, суббота-воскресенье это будет Флорида, Майами.
Folks need to get their preparations underway. It is always better to be prepared and then find out the storm doesn't hit you than to have it the other way around.
No, it certainly is, and we know that you are going to keep looking at this for us, Allison Chinchars. This is making its way over the Virgin Islands there. As you said, a Category 5 is what Irma is right now. Allison, thank you. Puerto Rico right now is under a state of emergency. Many fear that if the power goes, it's not going to be restored for weeks, maybe months. CNN's George Howell is there in San Juan, Puerto Rico for us. So, George, tell us what you're seeing. We obviously see wind, we hear the rain. What is the vantage point from where you are?
Brianna, yeah, so here along the north shore of this island, which is the part of the island that will be impacted most, the north and the eastern parts of it, we are starting to see these
рассказывают, что, короче, очень тяжелое положение.
So the strong winds, of course, the rain, flooding, and then aftermath. As far as winds go, I just spoke with a meteorologist here at the National Weather Center, Felix Castro. He says that the island has already experienced an 86-mile-per-hour wind gust, keeping in mind that the eye wall of the storm will now be closer to Puerto Rico, so 30 miles off the north shore, he says. So it will be much more intense given that the storm is closer. Keeping in mind, this is a Category 5 storm, unlike anything that has been recorded in the Atlantic Ocean, the strongest storm for sure this island has seen. When it comes to the rain, and you just heard Allison mention this, these strong bands, they come and go, the winds come and go, but we are expecting another several of these strong bands to hit us. They just come in one after the other, and that condition will continue hour by hour, 8 p.m. When things get worse. And that brings us to flooding. So they expect a storm surge of anywhere from 2 to 3 feet. However, they're also concerned about storm swell, or the ocean swells, so that could be anywhere from 25 to 30 feet of water. It's like 2 to 3 stories of water that could come in at any point here along this island, so conditions could get really bad, especially in those low-lying areas. And finally, the aftermath. You talked about the power grid here. It is vulnerable. Locals even say, you know, it's not very reliable.
Да, конечно, можно не позавидовать людям, которые вот именно вот эти острова, вот туда, вот ближе к Флориде, Майами. Им надо срочно, конечно, эвакуироваться, запасаться водой, ну, в общем, всем, чем можно, потому что неизвестно, какие последствия могут быть. А последствия, видно, тяжелые будут, потому что очень серьезный. Сильный очень ураган.
Big concern, realistic concern there. George Howell in San Juan, thank you, sir. You heard George talking about how unusual this is. Irma is only the 4th storm in the recorded history of Atlantic hurricanes to grow this strong, and weather experts are stunned by what they're seeing. One of those experts joining me right now, we have Seth Borenstein.
Ну, это приходится, типа, аналитики рассказывают. Вот он так улыбается, с такой улыбочкой. Что тут смешного, конечно, непонятно.
Like Irma. What is it about Irma?
Да, что-то они так все воспринимают, это все так странно, так с ухмылкой на лице. Конечно, в студии, конечно, прикольно сидеть, а людям, которые там.
That was 145-mile-an-hour winds.
Sustained. 145 sustained.
This is 40 miles an hour more. There has never been anything this powerful in the open Atlantic. In the Gulf and the Caribbean, there have been only a few other storms like this, and only one storm stronger, and that was Alan at 1988.
Ребята, я постараюсь немножко так держать камеру, чтобы вам было приятно немножко так смотреть. Дело в том, что я сейчас не могу на штатив поставить.
Wind as a hazard, and you're looking at storm surge as a big hazard, and then
так что извиняюсь за качество.
Ну,
качество нормальное вроде бы, да?
Between 145 and 185, that increase, is it exponential? Is each mile per hour equal to the last mile per hour?
Well, a lot of it depends on where you are and trying to survive.
Yeah.
And that depends
вот
on
это я не понимаю то, что показывают. Это он уже зашел туда, в Пуэрто-Рико? Или еще нет? Эти кадры, видимо, да, потому что так посмотреть не слабо вообще. Ужас, что делается.
How strong you are built, and very few places build for something like this, because this used to be one of those storms that you'd only fear about, and now it's not.
Seth, when you're looking at the range of possibilities here, we're still charting the path. So, you know, we still have this cone of uncertainty in a way, but we do know this is coming upon Puerto Rico at this point in time. When you say you're looking at Florida, what is the range of possibility in severity and maybe best case scenario and worst case scenario?
Well, luckily, perhaps the best case scenario is the one that's the current.
Ну, в общем, неизвестно, как будет развиваться сценарий этого всего дела.
Along the edge of the Florida coast, because the strongest winds, the strongest storm surge, everything's stronger in that northeast quadrant. So that keeps that northeast quadrant out to sea. So that, if it follows that track, that's good for one thing, but it's bad for another because it brings you up the entire South Florida area where you've got lots of people in the building, up Cape Canaveral, up Jacksonville, which hasn't experienced anything, and then into the Georgia and the Carolinas. So you are keeping the worst damage out to the sea, but you're hitting an awful lot of developed places and big places. One of the other scenarios that was favored a day or so ago, and some of the models were pointing, had it Irma going straight down the middle of Florida.
Давайте немножко так послушаем, что говорят. Кто понимает там английский. Сейчас я сделаю так более, чтобы стабилизировать изображение. Сейчас, секунду. Сейчас я сделаю. Сейчас я сделаю так.
So there are three bad scenarios. This is, this one keeps the worst winds away, but it does hit a lot more people in buildings.
And that's why we're taking this so seriously. Seth Borenstein, thank you so much for lending your expertise. We do appreciate it. A science writer with the AP, 25 plus years of experience. We're back to storm coverage in just a moment. We must go now to some other major breaking news videos from the White House. So President Trump is going against his own party leader.
Вот то, что показывают сейчас в данный момент. Ну, здесь переключают каналы. Это новостные каналы, новости. Вот он рассказывает. Ну, движение, направление, силы ветра.
So yeah, you're going to have hazards over a large area, regardless of where the center goes. So people don't want to pay too much attention to the exact location of the center. And remember, there are track forecast areas out here. At day 4 and 5 can be, or on average, are about 200 miles. So if we make a shift in the forecast, 30 or 40 miles one way or the other.
Сейчас мы позже звякнем нашим знакомым, которые живут в Флорида, Майами. Вот уже с некоторыми я уже поддерживаю связь. Вот то, что показывают, передают. Вот сам ураган, видите, красный. В середине это очень тяжелый. Сан-Джуан, да. Он подходит, Сан-Джуан. То есть сегодня. Так, немножко, давайте, кто понимает английский.
Minimum central pressure is down. Now the winds have remained constant at 185 miles per hour. But when you see the minimum central pressure drop, that's a sign of the strength of the storm. The lower the number, the stronger the storm. I wouldn't be surprised in the next update from the National Hurricane Center to see the winds actually increase a bit. I think that's a possibility.
Я немножко отвлекусь, потому что у меня здесь настройка чата. Пишите, кто сейчас нас смотрит здесь на канале.
A little bit more to the east. Now, as of right now, it's pushing off to the west-northwest. So up next for it would be places like the Virgin Islands. Okay, you take a look here. This is a perfect thing to be shown right now because this storm is, first of all, it's enormous. But second of all of those lines, okay, these are the spaghetti models, right? So every different colored line is a different computer model handling the storm. They're all pushing it to the west-northwest. You can see how tightly grouped they are. They also every single one of them have some kind of a turn to the north. The question is,
except for this one, right? But
even that still has it's still a northerly component. You've got to say, hey, somewhere around central Cuba, that's turning north in some fashion. Some are almost turning it due north, even greater than the 90-degree angle. What we're looking at here is
сам ураган образовался в Тихом океане. Набрал обороты уже к вот именно к островам Сан-Джуан, Пуэрто-Рико, пуэрториканским. Сейчас, конечно, достанется, конечно, Пуэрто-Рико не слабо.
This is a very strong storm that we're looking at here.
Wouldn't, as the hurricane passes over these land masses, specifically as it gets around Cuba, wouldn't that sort of help break it up?
Without a doubt, especially the eastern portions of Cuba. One of the big things that a hurricane hates three different things. It hates cold water, it hates headwinds, winds coming right at it, and it hates mountainous terrain. I mean, it doesn't like, it prefers warm water over land, but it hates mountains. Now, the eastern portion of Cuba has a lot of mountains. Is this going to be traveling over the landmass, or is it going to be staying just offshore? Take a look at those models. Very few actually put them right onto the landmass. They put them over the Bahamas. Well, Vlad, the Bahamas aren't helping a heck of a lot.
Yeah, they're flat.
Very flat, super shallow water, very warm. I've actually seen some storms strengthen there. I saw Wilma strengthen. Listen to this. How's this for a crazy hurricane tidbit? I watched Hurricane Wilma strengthen as it came across the Florida Peninsula. It was a devastating storm around the Yucatan of Mexico, then hung out in the Gulf of Mexico. Got to the west coast of Florida. Everybody thought, okay, well, now as it pushes towards the east coast, it's gonna fade away some. It's basically traveling over the Everglades. It actually held every bit of its strength and maybe bumped itself up a little bit over land. And how crazy is that?
So we were talking earlier about these storm chasers that go into the hurricanes to get data, reliable scientific data. You've done that, right? We have some video here of a storm chaser.
Это сейчас кадры с самолета. Видно, пассажирский, не пассажирский. Съемки кто-то вел с мобильного телефона, видео.
They are prop planes that fly into the hurricanes.
Да, не слабо.
The National Hurricane Center now does have their Hurricane Hunter jets, but for the most part, the fleet of Hurricane Hunters still prop planes that go in, and there's a little from.
Да, ребятки, не забываем, заходим в пятницу на стрим, скорее всего, это будет, да, пятница. Но мы еще, конечно, будем тоже интересоваться новостями с ураганом. Будем все время, будем быть в курсе.
The atmosphere in front of the storm. So we know, hey, is this moving into an environment that is more conducive for it to strengthen, or that's a deterrent to its strengthening? We look at all those things.
Lonnie Quinn, we will be talking to you, my friend, throughout the course of the day and throughout the course of the week as the storm heads towards the Florida coast.
В пятницу, да, хотел сказать, в пятницу будет стрим, скорее всего, с
This is where
косметикой.
part of the mayor's office and firehouse have been completely destroyed. You can, I mean, it's so bad you can barely see the structures there. The entire island has been in the dark since 6 o'clock this morning after losing electricity completely. President Trump has declared states of emergency in Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and Florida. As forecasts show, the state of Florida could begin to feel the impact of Irma on Saturday with the potential for a very strong hurricane very close to or over Miami as early as Sunday.
Winds right now. During the next few hours, we're going to see the eye of Irma move generally west-northwestward. That's going to take the core of the hurricane very close to the British and northern U.S. Virgin Islands later today, and then pass north or near the north coast of Puerto Rico as we get into tonight.
Okay, is it still too far out to be able to tell where and if it will hit Florida?
Well, right now, we're expecting a west-northwestward track for the next several days, and then as we get into the weekend, we're expecting Irma to gradually turn northward, but there's a lot of uncertainty in the timing and location of that turn. Right now, our forecast has a gradual turn with the track near the Florida Peninsula as we get into Sunday night and early Monday, but there are models that have been showing a track a little farther to the left, a track a little farther to the right, so this far out, there's a lot of uncertainty in that timing of that turn, so it's too early to determine exactly where in Florida those direct impacts might occur, but everybody there should certainly be monitoring Irma's progress and listening to the advice.
Chad, what are you seeing? I see the map you just had on there with the storm making a big right-hand turn somewhere either close to Havana or east of Havana and sending that thing through the Bahamas. Here's where the storm is now on Puerto Rican radar here from San Juan. Very heavy squalls hitting the northern part of Puerto Rico through Vieques and Culebra, and also even here now to the BVI, Virgin Gorda, Tortola, Beef Island, all the way up to Necker Island, where I've heard Sir Richard Branson is going to ride this out. I hope he changed his mind. Otherwise, U.S. Virgin Islands here to the south, especially St. Croix, a little bit farther away from the eye itself. There will be significant damage from Megan's Bay to Charlotte Amalie. Those are the U.S. Virgin Islands. We did have Barbuda in the forecast for yesterday. The eye went right over the top of it. We went to 155 miles per hour, and the anemometer broke. We have no idea how high the wind actually got. It was gusting to 185. It probably got there. No communication from that island for the last 6 hours. We do not have a crew there because we knew how dangerous it would be. So waiting for official word out of that island. Turks and Caicos are kind of next as it moves on by to the northeast of Puerto Rico. I believe the strongest winds in Puerto Rico proper may be about 120 because you're not in the eye proper, but not that far away. You're going to get a lot of damage at 120. There goes the eye, there goes the center, and where it turns, I'm afraid by 120 hours, no one truly knows. But this is the big question. We all know where it's going for a while, but then all of a sudden it has to turn north. Does it turn over the Bahamas and just destroy some of these islands here, or does it turn over South Florida at 140 or 150 miles per hour with millions and millions of people in that path?
Chad Myers, thank you for working around. Coming in for the National Hurricane Center on Irma's track. Let's get over to CNN's meteorologist Chad Myers for much more on that. Chad, what is the very latest? What are you hearing?
It does appear that we will have... I'm sorry, the producers are yelling in my ear. The track now is moved to the east, slightly over, I would say, closer to Miami than Isla Morada, but that's later in the forecast. Let me get to the beginning here. 85-mile-per-hour winds, wind moving north-northwest at about 16 miles per hour. Here's the center of the storm, very close to the British Virgin Islands. Virgin Gorda, Anegada, Necker Island, Tortola, back toward the U.S. Virgin Islands as well, and that's the area that will have the 185-mile-per-hour winds. Now let's get to the change. You talked about it a little bit earlier today, about 20 miles farther west than where we are now. Now, what do I tell you every single time? Please don't focus on the middle of the cone. The only thing is, the entire cone has shifted 20 miles farther to the east. So maybe moving, or at least closer to moving offshore or even in toward the Bahamas. That's because the European model has shifted slightly to the east as well. The National Hurricane Center said, hey, we're going to go with that right now. It's also agreeing with the American model. The new runs are running right now. They started about 8 o'clock in the morning Eastern time, and they take 2 to 3 hours to run. Even the European takes about 6 hours to run. So when that comes in, you may get a brand new track at 5 p.m. Please tune in there because that will be crucial. The closer we get to landfall time, the better these forecasts get. Right now, we're 200 miles left or right. That's the average air for 4 days out. There's San Juan, all of Puerto Rico, getting very hard with some of these outer bands, but the wind right here, that's Virgin Gorda right there, that's Anegada right there. We are going to see significant damage through the British Virgin Islands. The big story here, what happened overnight. Yesterday, we had some of these over here into the Gulf of Mexico. Kate, overnight, very, very few of them are to the west. They are all now either to the east or to the northeast of Florida, possibly even making landfall in the Carolinas if it truly does miss Florida. Kate?
So it sounded like
as well. We don't have to watch those at this point, but this is the one causing all of the problems, getting very close to Puerto Rico. I will also tell you, while you say it's a large storm, large in size, the worst of the winds are in a fairly small area right around the center of the storm. So if this storm goes just to the north of Puerto Rico, hopefully we can spare the worst of it here along the shore. Certainly there's going to be rain and there's going to be wind, but maybe not those 185 mile an hour winds. I will tell you, the storm cutting through now right in towards the British Virgin Islands, just right towards the U.S. Virgin Islands. There's going to be incredible damage there, and it's going to cut through the Turks and Caicos and into Bahamas, and I think we'll see devastating consequences from it there. After that point, then it gets much more interesting for us here across the U.S. And I will tell you, we talked about this cone of uncertainty. This really is an uncertain one. We know the storm is going to continue to pull off towards the west here and make a right-hand turn. When it makes this pretty sharp right-hand turn, you see it's running along the coast here of Florida. Last year we had Hurricane Matthew that kind of did the same thing and fortunately stayed just offshore. We might not see this make any kind of a landfall in Florida. If you're in Georgia and South Carolina, be watching this as well. We're going to continue to talk a lot about that. Florida, obviously, in the short term, you're in the path. I'm not saying you aren't going to have this. You certainly are going to have impacts. But we still, Harris, can't say if there will be a direct hit in Florida or not. And so everybody here needs to be prepared. Sometimes, Harris, we have a really good idea on where storms are going, and sometimes we don't. Unfortunately, this is one of those that we don't.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that I know the FEMA director and others have been saying today is that we want to be careful not to say that this hasn't hit United States territory already, or that it won't, because we have islands down in the Caribbean, and we've got all of Puerto Rico.
Yeah, in fact, that's under the gun right now. The U.S. Virgin Islands, as I just mentioned, getting it right now. Puerto Rico later on today and tonight, certainly getting some very big impacts from it. Whether it takes a direct hit or not, or gets into that eye wall, we can't say just yet, but there will definitely be impacts from it there. There will be impacts and likely a landfall in the U.S., whether it's Florida, Georgia, or South Carolina. We just can't say that just yet.
Wow, that cone of uncertainty is wider than a cone, it would seem, on this one. Glad you're watching it for us, Rick. Thank you. We'll check back with him as the news warrants.
185 miles per hour.
No, the closest I can remember even reporting on was Haiyan, and that was in the Eastern Pacific there, way out to the west near the Philippines, and that was 195, and we had Anderson Cooper on the ground there for weeks covering that event. This thing went right over Barbuda. It did damage. We have not heard from that island in now 6 hours. It also went over St. Martin and Anguilla, and it is truly right now over the British Virgin Islands. There's an island right there, Virgin Gorda, Bitter End Yacht Club right there. I don't understand this, but Sir Richard Branson is on that island right there in a wine cellar. I think when he gets out of there later today, I think he will tell us what a unwise decision that was to ride this 185 mile per hour wind out. Everything will be demolished on those islands there in the BVI, and probably not faring much better will be the U.S. Virgin Islands from Charlotte Amalie all the way up to Magens Bay. This will be a devastating impact. We know about parts of Bermuda. They're saying that some spots, as the hurricane went over, ripped all the vegetation out of the ground. There's not a bit of vegetation left. So where does it go from here? It gets into the Turks and Caicos, but there's not much land there, so we don't expect too much of a loss of power. Still 160, then 155, and maybe making a turn toward Florida. I say maybe, because if we look at all these models, they all turn this storm very hard to the right, John. Very hard. But when does that happen? Does that happen right over Monroe County and on up into Miami-Dade? That would be likely the most devastating hurricane in U.S. history. Does it turn to the right and go over the Bahamas? For the Bahamas, a devastating hit here. Or does it wait and get all the way west of Key West and get west of here? This is less likely. This is somewhere in the middle. And this right here is, as most of the computer models now are talking, a slight right turn just to the east of Miami Beach. But still, Miami Beach could have winds of 150. Could you imagine what that would do to the high rises in the buildings and everything on Miami Beach? That would be a real mess. Now, that's still 4.5 days away. So keep that in mind.
And in those 4.5 days, important for everybody who lives there or has loved ones there, keep in touch with Chad Myers here. Keep in touch and listen to your local officials as this plays out. Chad, we'll check back with you as developments warrant. Turning now to 185 miles per hour.
No, the closest I can remember even reporting on was Haiyan, and that was in the Eastern Pacific there, way out to the west near the Philippines, and that was 195, and we had Anderson Cooper on the ground there for weeks covering that event. This thing went right over Barbuda. It did damage. We have not heard from that island in now 6 hours. It also went over St. Martin and Anguilla, and it is truly right now over the British Virgin Islands. There's an island right there, Virgin Gorda, Bitter End Yacht Club right there. I don't understand this, but Sir Richard Branson is on that island right there in a wine cellar. I think when he gets out of there later today, I think he will tell us what a unwise decision that was to ride this 185 mile per hour wind out. Everything will be demolished on those islands there in the BVI, and probably not faring much better will be the U.S. Virgin Islands from Charlotte, Mali, all the way up to Magens Bay. This will be a devastating impact. When we know about parts of Bermuda, they're saying that some spots, as the hurricane went over, ripped all the vegetation out of the ground. There's not a bit of vegetation left. So where does it go from here? It gets into the Turks and Caicos, but there's not much land there, so we don't expect too much of a loss of power. Still 160, then 155, and maybe making a turn toward Florida. I say maybe, because if we look at all these models,
planes that go in, and there's a little, I guess to describe it simply, there's a little hole in the bottom of the plane, right? Bear with me here.
What they all turn this storm very hard to the right.
Drops on.
Very hard. But when does that happen? Does that happen right over Monroe County and on up into Miami-Dade? That would be likely the most devastating hurricane in U.S. history. Does it turn to the right and go over the Bahamas? For the Bahamas, a devastating hit here. Or does it wait and get all the way west of Key West and get west of here? This is less likely. This is somewhere in the middle, and this right here is, as most of the computer models now are talking, a slight right turn just to the east of Miami Beach, but still Miami Beach could have winds of 150. Could you imagine what that would do to the high rises in the buildings and everything on Miami Beach? That would be a real mess. Now, that's still 4.5 days away, so keep that in mind.
And in those 4.5 days, important for everybody who lives there or has loved ones there, keep in touch with Chad Myers.
Хорошо, ребята, в общем, будем следить за новостями. Так, вкратце мы поняли, да. Будем следить за новостями. Давайте, до встречи. Спасибо, кто смотрел.